Okay, firstly, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the start of the second day of the EEAC annual conference that has been hosted by NESC, that's the National Economic Social Council in Dublin, Ireland. But of course, given the times we're in, this conference is happening online, so we welcome you all. Join us from around the globe, hopefully. My name is Damien Thomas, and I'm from the NESC, and I'm going to be your chair for this spotlight session on just transition, vulnerability, and policy responses. And I think it's going to be a really interesting session as we have three excellent speakers and the chair as well, obviously. So just setting the context for this session, I mean, it's evident that if Europe is going to transition to a more sustainable economy, society, and environment, this will require comprehensive transformation and change. Now, obviously, this transition provides large opportunities, but it also comes with significant social economic challenges for affected communities. And whilst there's ongoing uncertainty about the nature of transitioning to a low carbon future, what is known is it will have a disproportionate impact on certain jobs, sectors, communities, and regions, as we know in Ireland from our recent experience of the Midlands. Addressing this situation will require commitment to just transition and a concerted policy focus by government and other stakeholders, including social partners, on maximising quality alternatives and opportunities for those workers, firms, sectors, communities and regions who are most vulnerable to this change. So the aim of this section is to explore the vulnerability associated with the low carbon transition and try to highlight some practical advice for policymakers and broader society in how we should respond. The format of the session will involve two presentations by Cathal Fitzgerald and Rowena Dwyer, and then Professor John Tomley will provide a response to these papers. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, and you can post your questions, and then we'll seek to ask as many as possible. Just in terms of anybody out there who wants to tweet, the hashtag is EEAC28 or hashtag just transition, and you can tag at NESC Ireland or at EEAC_network. So now to my first speaker, my colleague from NESC, Dr. Cathal Fitzgerald, who's a researcher and an analyst focusing on institutional and public policy issues. And he was the project lead and one of the authors of a recent report on addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland. And Cathal's going to focus on the issue of what do we do about the issue of vulnerable workers. So over to Cathal.
Thank you, Damien. And Jonathan, if you can move on to my first slide, please. I appreciate that. And thanks to Rowena and John also. Most of all, welcome to all of you online, and thanks for joining us. I'll move on to my first slide, please, dear Jonathan. If I'd like to begin with a little bit about the background to our research. Our research was a result of a request by the Irish government here in two national strategies. In the Future Jobs Ireland strategy and in the Climate Action Plan, the government asked NESC to examine the specific issue of vulnerability for workers, firms and sectors caused by two transitions and to provide recommendations. So our project was about not one, but two transitions to low carbon and to a more technological economy. What action could the state take to protect jobs as part of a just transition? We know transitions are important, they're disruptive, they'll be costly to some, and that makes them contentious and difficult. So we really need to understand them. So that's what the research is about. What it's not about, just to be clear, was research to show how Ireland should transition to a low carbon economy. NESC has many separate reports on that going back to 2012. So the method for our research was, as you'd expect, a working group of interests to try really get voices from the ground and around the policy system involved in the project from the start, literature review, international case studies of transitions in Germany, Australia, Spain, and in Scotland. We looked very carefully at the case of the Midlands in Ireland, where there's a specific issue, and the transition is emerging quickly for communities in the Midlands in Ireland. And we also did a deep dive into one sector, the transport sector, So lots of consultation and evidence to try help policymakers understand what there can be abstract concepts. We published recommendations in March this year. It's available on our website, nesk.ie, and it's really about how to address employment vulnerability as part of the Just Transition, the core issue for the conference. So on the next slide now, please. What did we find out about a just transition? Well, a few lessons. Firstly, transitions are, as I said, they're complex, they're messy, and they take time. It's taken 60 years more of permanent structural change in the Ruhr Valley to transition from a coal and steel reliant region. Second, while general lessons can be learned from what has worked well elsewhere, unfortunately for policymakers here and everywhere, there's no readily available template, no recipe or off-the-shelf approach. Third, context and past experiences of transition can significantly shape a region's response. Again, as we've seen in parts of Europe, experience of political change, German reunification, etc., shape policy responses to economic shifts and transitions. Unsurprisingly, preparation is required for a just transition, whether it is led by government, whether it's a regional or local community-based actors. Plans must be put in place and followed up upon with government support. And I'll come back to the Irish government's Just Transition Fund later as an example. A fifth lesson is that social dialogue is an effective mechanism, really just to foster trust. So this is all about participation, as I say, throughout the process, and trust is part of building real participation and getting to problem solving, rather than just a conflictual approach to transition. In this regard, place is almost everything. An inclusive place-based approach is vital. Get to the region, make plans not for the region, but with the region. There's a lot of discussion at yesterday's main session about co-design, and that's really important in response. And actually, even in the research, this research was done with participation with affected areas, not just for affected areas. So that means dedicating resources. We found that public sector investment in support of alternative infrastructure, it's an important driver of transition. And the last message then is good personnel restructuring processes, and they need to be well defined. They can lead to an orderly phase out for workers, and that's really where those pinch points are for communities, and that multiplier effect where employment is lost, incomes are lost, and throughout the community, income streams and things that keep fabric of small communities moving are lost. So you need good start with the personnel restructuring and help orderly work out, phase out and transition for workers. There's some of the lessons. You probably noticed that I haven't said exactly what we mean by just transition. On the next slide, I might go into a definition. Jonathan, please. For NESC, a just transition is one which seeks to ensure that a transition is fair. So it's fair, it's equitable, and it's inclusive. Importantly, it's in terms of the outcomes, so what people get to, so where their destination point is, that has to be fair. But how they get there also has to be inclusive. It also has to be fair. So a just transition is one that is fair, equitable, and inclusive in terms of the process. That means that the government's approach must be purposeful. You have to maximize participation. The state must take a multifaceted approach. It's not just about protecting jobs. It's about opportunities. It's about communities. Now, that said, the state has to ensure appropriate social protection and services and the infrastructure for those at risk from transition. And that means providing supportive arrangements and sectoral measures, which I'll come to. But these must be place-based. There can be a tendency for, and particularly, I suppose, across larger economies and societies, for national instruments, which you need place-based services and infrastructure. So inclusive place-based strategies, investing in low carbon and digital ready infrastructure and communities, and investing in households. So household level targeted supports really work. Government should establish a social dialogue, as I said, a process to co-design those actions. So one key part then is the vulnerable workers, and that's the focus of the policy session. So on the next slide now, please, we'll talk about who those vulnerable workers might be. I said transitions are complex, and this makes certainty elusive. And that's a real challenge for advisory bodies and for policymakers. We all strive for evidence-based policy making, but uncertainty gets in the way, and it just makes it difficult for us. So part of the problem for us in this particular instance is the limitations of modelling. So, for example, we don't model the two transitions together, even though we know they're closely intertwined and happening right now. So we don't model the transition to carbon and digital together. And modeling the low carbon transition is almost exclusively focused on the impact of carbon pricing, on carbon tax. And as we know, there's a lot more, and there needs to be a lot more to transition to low carbon than just carbon pricing. What we do know from modelling, it does tell us that the effect in aggregate on employment is likely to be modest. So the OECD's analysis, models a $50 carbon tax leads to a 0.3% churn in employment. So that's relatively low in a standard economy, pre-pandemic economic. The churn in the job market has been 2 and 7%. So at 0.3%, the churn related to the transition is small. That's just from carbon pricing. The ILO's 2018 research projects a potential net gain in employment. Our own work here in Ireland says that with no recycling of revenue, the government's target of an €80 per tonne carbon tax could spur a gross loss of employment by 2030 of around 7,000 or just above 7,000 jobs. When you recycle the revenue from the carbon tax, the loss of employment is smaller, and that's a gross, not a net loss. One of the reasons why the impact is small in the Irish case is that the affected sectors make up a relatively small share of employment in Ireland. So the supply of fossil fuels, generation of electricity, water, transport, they're relatively small employers in the national sense. Agriculture is facing specific difficulties, and I'll come back to that. Another reason for uncertainty is that our deep dive into the transport sector that I mentioned at the start, that didn't reveal what we thought would be the pathology of why and how jobs are lost in a specific sector. So none of the experts that we interviewed could see why either transition, either to low carbon or digital, would lead to net job losses, say, in the freight or logistics sector. So that was a surprise for us, given the use of fossil fuel and the risk of automation. So more work is needed to get to that pathology. Now, there are regional effects of transition, but they are also modest. From the modelling, in the Irish case, only a handful of counties are estimated to see a net fall in employment, the largest share being by 2030 being here in Dublin, of a 0.1% reduction in net employment. But the transition and change will profoundly affect specific communities. So the thing is that what's hidden by the aggregate, even if the aggregate is small, we do know that, as I say, it's disruptive and costly for some. And you need to focus in on those areas where that impact is going to be, which can be more qualitative rather than quantitative research that's going to inform that. So that said, whilst we only may know a little about it, we can still do a lot. Next slide, please, Jonathan. Despite all the uncertainty, the Council thinks that a proactive response by government is not only necessary, but it's possible. And it would be a mistake to separate the response from Ireland's overall transition, just the low carbon, to look at economic change in the round and the global forces that are impacting on the economy. So addressing vulnerability should be just one part of a progress towards a vision. This was mentioned a lot at yesterday's session. We need a direction of travel. We need a destination. For the Council, it's a resilient, sustainable, thriving net zero economy where we use innovation to shape what we want. So that's the overall goal and destination that the Council have set out, and underpinning that is sticking to the task of generating high quality employment. So while our line of sight about where vulnerability is going to fall, that might be poor, if we can continue to have what's known as a good jobs economy, and we can come back to that later maybe in the discussion, making all jobs better, so to speak, is the best way to protect the overall employment base from transitions. So your strategies on education, on the rural economy, on labour market, Indigenous enterprise development, which Rowena is going to speak about, they should all reflect the transitions. So they should be actively addressing the transitions to low carbon and digital. They shouldn't be side products or byproducts. So these important sectoral strategies must recognise the transition. And below this then sit what the Council see as three drivers of action. The first reflects a consensus in the literature that lifelong learning, worker training, and education represent the best way to prepare and adjust for vulnerability. So continuous workforce development. The second driver must be a resilient enterprise base. So the concept of resilience has been central to national enterprise policy in Ireland since 2018. It is the new paradigm, resilience. We've seen that. In the Irish case, it seems to be displacing this idea of competitiveness as the key driver of enterprise policy. And particularly in light of the pandemic, resilience has become one of the most sought after and cherished qualities of public policy. And the transitions made that real in any event. So resilience in the enterprise base is important. Ireland has, like many countries, has a well-established architecture for supporting enterprises, for attracting FDI, for supporting R&D. But those sorry, if you stay on that slide, please. Those supports tend to be focused on growth and scaling, high growth firms, high potential startups, and product development and scaling. What we learned from the research into the transitions is that you need to focus also on viable but vulnerable firms. It's a shift, that a pivot that some state support agencies need to take. So that's the challenge for state supports. How do you support a viable but vulnerable firm? How to support vulnerable firms to maintain the employment they have, not so much to take on 10 more staff, but to keep the existing 20 staff that they have. Thirdly, the state has already allocated, many states do, substantial investment through their various climate action funding and streams, and we see it now at an EU level, obviously. In Ireland, we have the Just Transition Fund. The key there is making sure that the funding gets to these communities directly. So support transition, make sure that that money has the greatest possible impact, and we have recommendations about how to make sure that the money that comes out from the centre reaches the most affected communities. So each of these three drivers, we make a number of recommendations about how to make them real. So quickly then, moving on. The first driver I mentioned was continuous preemptive workforce development. So that means increasing your ambition for workforce development. So typically you have national targets for employee training. Here in Ireland, we say we should be retraining 30,000 workers and 5,000 firms over a 4-year period. So set ambitious targets for that, national targets. You need to appropriately resource the key bodies. In Ireland, they're the regional skills forums. There's probably similar institutions in your own areas. Make sure they're well resourced. Next, you need to incentivize employers. One thing we found that was key was you need to incentivize employers to help attend training programs, workers attend training programs that may not be relevant to their current work. And that isn't the norm for employers. They will need an incentive to do that. If someone is going to be changing career from their current employer, how do you incentivize the employer to give them some time off during the week or over a sustained period to retrain? Part of this then is having the information on skills. So you need to improve the information on the availability of skills by making greater use of skills audits. That means making a better use of information you have about people's informal skills. Typically, in the new roles, to be maybe using softer skills if they're moving into a new career. How do you recognize people informal skills? How do you get that information shared between the state, between firms and workers? Thirdly, we have to increase the momentum behind our efforts to increase participation in lifelong learning. So you'll probably find in each economy that they have cohorts of workers that are underrepresented in lifelong learning, and you need to target your efforts there. Fourthly, we need to enhance the skills and training advice available. You need to provide it to workers before they may come unemployed. You don't need that employment to trigger the state interventions and actions. And that action needs to be more quality one-to-one coaching, counselling and mentoring. An important part of that is making destination sector. Where is it that the worker is going to land? That'd be a key consideration in the design of the worker training earlier in the programs. Next slide, please. Driver 2 is building resilient enterprises. And as I say, Rowena, our excellent second speaker, is going to talk a little bit about this. So the Council has recommended that the state extend appropriate enterprise supports to these viable but vulnerable firms. And COVID has amplified this need. It's not straightforward, and it does involve a pivot and a reallocation of resources. Next, preparing for transition is not the same as preparing for Brexit, in our case, or responding to the pandemic, but there are lessons. If you look at the outreach and support that states have delivered to firms and sectors, Ireland is a particular case in point, but the amount of assistance that was provided to firms to prepare for Brexit. In preparing for Brexit, you know, the state convenes interagency events, it does scenario planning, it targets funding. All of this should be continued and reoriented for the transitions. We can learn from existing schemes. In Ireland, we have a productivity voucher scheme to encourage micro and small enterprises to engage in productivity training. That can inform us on how a transition voucher might work to provide direct funding. The state should consider increased support to SMEs to allow them undertake development projects in areas that can build resilience. So that means digitalization. Make sure that firms can have the funds and easy application for innovation support to make it as easy as possible for the firm to build resilience. And support things like local enterprise networks. Some vulnerable SMEs don't have the wherewithal, the same that the large firms will do, so networks can really help. Finally, the literature and our experience from what we saw in the Midlands and what they told us highlights the necessity of taking action early. So supports should be designed to provide firms who are prepared to be early movers inside of the transition, in dealing with the low carbon or digital transition, to help them make that first step. Moving on then to the third and final driver. This is about high impacted targeted funding. So we need to develop specific means of targeting financial support towards those most impacted. So social clauses are a good example of how you can ring fence either sectorally or geographically funding from the state to make sure it hits those most impacted communities. The other idea is self-identification. So community self-identification. We have some experience of this in Ireland. We had a scheme that ran after the financial crash, where enterprises self-designated and met some criteria to receive funding. So not only does that help you target the funding, that's a source of on-the-ground information to the state. And as I said earlier on, we do have a poor line of sight of where vulnerability is going to fall. So if you have these self-identification mechanisms, it allows you to target funding, but also it's a source of information for the centre. We need to improve supports for actually applying for funds. So a lot of smaller local communities and NGOs, again, not great wherewithal and resources to draw down funding. So a small amount of seed funding, more place-based investment in drawing down large national funds would benefit those communities. And you need to have those funds place-based. We have a Western Development Fund in Ireland. We could see about how that model would work in more targeted regions. We need to enhance engagement between state institutions and the centre. So in Ireland, we have a strategic banking corporation, microloans funds. They need to engage with the EIB and others to make sure that we're maximising the use of funds. So that's a quick summary. We have a series of reports that are published that underpin all of those. I want to finish off with a couple of slides about how this happens and making it happen. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. A key issue seems to be moving from the research and the evidence base into practical schemes and interventions by the state. And the council realise that determined action by governments is required to make all or any of this happen. So the government needs to set out priority actions. It needs to sequence the interventions. It needs a time frame for implementation and consider the resources that are needed. But you really need a named body. So taking forward recommendations and giving consideration to these priorities, they don't fall naturally under the home of usually any one state apparatus, department or institution, but you need to assign responsibility for making it happen to a named body. Also, communications is key, and we make a series of recommendations about the serious communications effort that's needed related to transitions. For a lot of firms, the transitions remain an abstract concept, much as Brexit did for a long time, and it needs hard work. It needs a lot of hand-holding and intervention and communication and working, place-based working with firms and workers for them to understand what the transition means to them. So overall, we believe if the council takes the framework that has been set out for them and establishes a successful mechanism for delivery, a named institution, that can help the state address employment to vulnerability as part of a just transition. My last slide now is just an example of this in action. In June, following the publication of a report and the establishment of a Just Transition Commissioner, the government announced a Just Transition Fund. So it's a dedicated fund of €11 million. It's funding that's allocated in a competitive process, and it provides, for us, I think, a shorthand example of the council's recommendations in action. So if you think about our three drivers: continuous workforce development, building resilient enterprises, and targeted funding, well, the first priority of the Just Transition Fund is to support training, to retrain and reskill workers, and really assist communities in the Midlands region to adjust to low carbon transition. The second part of the funding stream is enterprise supports to support innovation and investment proposals to generate sustainable employment in green enterprise. And a third priority for the €11 million fund is a community-focused aspect. So establishing best practice to sharing networks and assisting development funding, local transition plans in the Midlands. So it's ring-fenced for regional activities in the Midlands and those communities most immediately impacted. So all of this is very welcome. It's all very encouraging to see evidence-based policy in action. What occurs to me as sort of a discussion point then is, and a provocative question maybe for our discussion later is, despite the years of agonizing and trying to deliver just transition mechanisms, will the just transition really just simply boil down to having a dedicated fund, dedicated to a region, dedicated to specific priorities? This is a key mechanism to date in Ireland. It isn't all that the state is doing. But I'm just wondering, are there shortcuts? Are there shortcuts the state can say, if it has the resources to simply just ring fence geographically and sectorally funding? Is that the way to do it? And how do you do that in a way that brings in the firms in a place-based participative process? And your views on that would really be welcome later on in the session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cathal. That was really great. You covered loads of material there and really informative and also thought-provoking. Now I'll go to our second speaker, Rowena Dwyer, who is Manager of Policy and Planning at Enterprise Ireland, and Rowena will present on the types of business supports that are available to assist enterprises in the context of transition. Thanks, Rowena.
Thank you very much, Damien. Just checking that I've come on properly here, Jonathan. Okay. Yeah, perfect. If everyone can hear me, I'll kick on. And look, everyone, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the session today. What I'm going to cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I suppose, is really the idea of, well, what is going on at the moment to support enterprises to address this challenge, but I think probably challenges in general. I think one of the things as I looked at this over the last little while is that really there are lessons in terms of what SMEs are faced with in general, and this whole concept of the just transition and digitalization, that an awful lot of the time what the challenges are, what the issues are, what the kind of the hurdles to address are very similar, and that's positive because it allows us to say, well, what do we know works and what doesn't work, and what could we learn from things that we've done before. So what I'm going to cover over the next little while then is to start with, I suppose, just to do a short introduction as to what Enterprise Ireland does, who we are and what we do and what we're trying to achieve with our companies. Then taking it a bit broader into the more general enterprise and overview of enterprise in Ireland and the challenges that we think our companies and more broadly SMEs face, and then how to support them, looking through the lens of what Cathal has done there, of those drivers, how they are being supported at the moment to address these challenges, how they can be supported more, or again, kind of what could we tailor or look at in more detail in the discussion on the just transition. So if I were to just move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so EI, who we are and what we do. So Enterprise Ireland was established 22 years ago. It's a state agency. It operates under the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And what we're responsible for is effectively Irish enterprises, or the indigenous enterprise exporting base. So we're supporting companies in manufacturing and internationally traded services sector to build a scale and effectively to internationalize, to operate on export markets. Ireland is a very small economy, as people know, and therefore the growth of our economy is dependent on us having companies and enterprises who are actually competing and winning overseas. The client profile is though very typical of the more general enterprise base. It's largely SMEs. I'll come to that in a moment. But there's about 4,000 Irish companies who operate within the Enterprise Ireland kind of mandate, and those are those who are currently exporting and those who are on their way to export. We work with these companies across the country. We have 10 regional offices. We also have 40 overseas offices who support them in those various locations. And that would be very consistent with the Government of Ireland's positioning over the last number of years, which is very much to expand Ireland's global footprint. We also work with, and I think this is very important to see the coordination of this, the vast majority of companies in Ireland are micro enterprises. It's the same across the EU. And we work with the 31 local enterprise offices, which are, as you can tell by the number of them, dotted all across Ireland, operating in every county in Ireland, predominantly helping companies to start, to scale, and be they companies who will go on to operate overseas, or companies who will stay focused on the domestic market. So what is it kind of our objectives are? Our objectives are to help high potential startups, Cathal already mentioned that, those with the real potential to internationalize. Also really to support all the companies we deal with to invest in innovation. Hugely important, and I'll come to that again and again probably in the next 15 minutes. And then also looking at how do we support companies to grow through leadership development, through investment, and through tackling these new challenges, making investments in technology and technology adoption, and looking at new areas that they are going to have to address in terms of diversifying new products, new markets, new services, new business models. Okay. And so in terms of the next slide, please, in terms then of what it is we focus on or have looked at, we're coming to the end of our 4-year strategy. There should be, if in normal times I'd be sitting here saying we've just developed our new 5-year strategy. Unsurprisingly, we took a pause on that earlier this year. We've developed a 12-month response for our companies. But in terms of looking just back for a minute, what the last 4 years was focused on, very much with the lens of the UK exit from the EU as being a huge focus of what we needed to support our companies to do, but keeping kind of sticking to the knitting, supporting companies to build a scale, to expand reach, and judging that, I suppose, by how our companies were doing in terms of their exports, in terms of the employment they provided, how much investment they were making in R&D. That was a key indicator for us, and how much were they doing themselves in-house, how much were they collaborating with research institutions, and how much were they leveraging from EU funds such as Horizon 2020. And then finally, I suppose a really key indicator, I mentioned there are 270,000 enterprises around Ireland in general, of which Enterprise Ireland companies represent about 4,000. How much are our companies spending in the domestic economy is a key feature as well. Why is that important? It's a whole multiplier effect as well. They are part of domestic and global supply chains, and their expenditure in the Irish economy is what drives economic activity across all parts of the country. In terms of employment then, if we could go to the next slide. By the end of 2019, Enterprise Ireland companies were flying it, as was the Irish economy. There were about 220,000 people employed in EI client companies, which would have represented just under 10% of the workforce, actually. And a huge regional focus and importance to Irish enterprises in the EI client portfolio being based and creating employment in the regions. You'll see there almost 2/3 of the new jobs that were created by companies in the Enterprise Ireland portfolio were outside of Dublin. And actually, very interestingly, when you look at the different regions, all of them actually would have recorded net growth in 2019, with the exception of the Midlands region. And it does actually show in just one snapshot there actually shows you this is why a targeted policy response is required on things such as the low carbon transition and targeting funding at areas that are really impacted by the transition to a low carbon economy, and in this instance in the Midlands, the cessation of peat production and the employment impact that actually has. Finally then, just the last thing on Enterprise Ireland, to our exports, which is on the next slide. Really interesting as well to always think about who are you dealing with and what is the composition of the base you're dealing with. Irish enterprise, the Irish exporting enterprise base is very strong in areas that Ireland would be known for in general from our multinational base, be that digital technologies or life sciences. But you'll see there that almost half of the exports for clients, for Enterprise Ireland clients, remain from the food sector. And that's a sector that over the last few years in particular has had to put a huge focus on how is it how is it going to respond to the UK exit from the EU? How will it diversify its products and its markets to be able to deal with the shock that is coming, the change to the trading relationship, whatever form and whatever level of impact that has, the necessity to both, I suppose, focus our companies on diversifying their products, diversifying their markets, and also at the same time strengthening their position as far as possible within the UK market. So that has been a huge focus. And then I'm finished my introduction now on the next slide, which is just a reminder for all of us to the challenges that Cathal has posed there for companies or for policymakers, in trying to address challenges such as the just transition or the low carbon transition. 99.8% of companies in Ireland are SMEs. 92% of them are micro enterprises. SMEs are responsible for over 2/3 of the employees in the country, and they generate almost half of the turnover. So they're hugely important, but they're a massive group of small companies. And even our own clients, I've just put by contrast down there, because of the fact that they are actually involved in exporting, as you would expect, their composition is different, but still only 5 to 6% of our clients would be deemed large companies. The vast majority remain SMEs, medium-sized, small enterprises, and with about a quarter in this high potential startup category, either pre-trading or on their way to scaling and growing. But what it does show is policy responses have to be something that makes sense for a small company, makes sense for a micro enterprise, and probably have to vary as well from the very targeted to the more broadly based, which is what I'm going to try and cover then in terms of looking at, well, how do you go about supporting enterprises? So to the next slide then, what are the challenges facing companies at the moment? Well, I think never more so would this be an understatement to say companies are operating in an environment that's increasingly dynamic and unpredictable. If someone had said 2 years ago to you, what were the challenges, you'd have said Brexit, quite obviously, and you'd have said the pace of technological development and digitalization and climate change. And they're all still correct. That's the issue. They haven't gone away. Those challenges are no less than they were. And suddenly on top of that, you have what for many companies is at this point an existential challenge, a challenge of survival in the form of COVID-19. And these challenges are really stressing and stretching our businesses and transforming how they do business. And for those, as I've said, where survival is an issue, for others, it is about how best can they adapt to transform and respond to these forces. Sorry, on to the next slide then, please. And so what, it's something that Cathal mentioned already. This is what is being identified at this point now, and quite rightly, as the key response for companies. What can companies do? It's about resilience. It's whether or not companies can kind of absorb changes. Can they recover critical functionality? And can they thrive in altered circumstances? And some of the traits of a resilient company, and really interesting, because I'll come to the trade-offs in a minute, are that they have levels of redundancy built into them, that they're not just so efficient that they have one supplier, one just in time delivery, all of those things that are probably seen as being highly efficient, but actually, and COVID-19 would have identified this, over reliance, over efficiency to the point of there being no redundancy probably did lead to situations where companies were very challenged in a short amount of time. The whole argument around how much stock to hold, and that suddenly has become much more of an open question maybe than it did in the past. But interestingly, and I think this is something that's worth bearing in mind, because of the preparations for the UK exit, companies had actually started to look at issues like this in order to build in a bit more resilience for changing circumstances. And when COVID-19 hit, we found that quite a few of our companies had greater resilience to the changes or to delays in supply chains or disruptions in supply chains than previously we would have expected. And it showed kind of not a correlation, but an outcome from some of the Brexit preparation was that companies had probably built in greater resilience or redundancy than previously they would have. Of course, other things that really we want to see companies doing is companies that are resilient are those that do foster innovation and build collaboration, kind of achieving economies of scale that you wouldn't have just by operating by yourself. But I put all of this in terms of framing it in reality as well. For SMEs in particular, this is a real balancing act. There's redundancy versus efficiency, that challenge. Customer demand now, and I just want to talk about this for a minute, versus long-term trends. That is a huge challenge. We've spoken to companies over the last number of years about the low carbon transition. We've only in recent weeks about it. We've spoken to them about investment in innovation, investment in product innovation. And the answer, not all the time, but often is yes, but. The answer is, yeah, we know it's coming, but this is what our customer wants right now. And so they're having the time, the time to identify new trends, maybe the skills to respond to new trends, and finding that balance between managing the day-to-day and doing that to the best of your ability versus being able to look up and look at the long-term trends and make a long-term investment. That absolutely is a challenge for companies, and a very, very understandable one. And that's where intervention, public intervention, has to step in. It's the whole purpose of it. You're stepping in to achieve an objective that the market itself isn't achieving. And I suppose one thing we always do need to bear in mind as well is levels of profitability in firms. How much do they actually allow for companies to make a long-term investment in something that may yield results into the future, but right now the payout from it may be unknown. And I think, again, in the discussions on the low carbon transition, this comes up again and again, and not just, it doesn't come up because companies just have this idea that there's a trade-off there. It's a reality. We know that an awful lot of investments, and we see this at domestic level as well. This isn't just a business issue, that the investments often are required are often long-term, and the payback periods can be quite long as well. So moving then to the next slide, and to just borrow, well, I suppose it was a brilliant framing for the discussion, looking at the drivers that Cathal and his team identified in their report for the just transition. So preemptive workforce development, building resilient enterprise, and delivering high impact targeted funding. What are we doing? And by we, I mean Enterprise Ireland and the broader enterprise support network and policy makers. What are we doing in these areas currently? And what do I suppose maybe I feel are the key issues or key kind of learners from those that we could use going forward? So going to the first one then, which is continuous preemptive workforce development. On to the next slide, please. I think critical for us in working with companies is helping companies to identify their skills needs. So there is a program of activities being led by our Department of Education entitled Skills for Growth. And what Enterprise Ireland is involved in here is a particular program called Spotlight on Skills. It's actually very apt. It's putting a spotlight, trying to get companies to take the time to focus on what are their skills need. And in talking to my colleague yesterday who runs this program, that they have now just moved online or have moved online in response to the changing circumstances, she was letting me know that the next set of workshops that are being undertaken in all regions across Ireland for companies to identify their skills needs, to be linked up with the education and training providers in the region, they are oversubscribed. Companies actually see the value in this support. It allows them to actually take that time to understand what it is they need, to identify that gap, and then most critically, to be linked up, and that's my third point there, to increase the interaction between industry and the education and training system via the regional skills fora in particular around the country who have that as their role. So that's where you see different agencies, different parts of the system really working together. One has the client base, helping them to identify their skills needs. The second part there are the enablers, those who can actually link the companies to the education and training system. And I think very importantly as well, what's critically important about this work is that those skills that are identified, those skills needs, our education and training system then needs to respond to that and needs to build the programs put the programs in place that actually will meet those skills needs. Critically important, I think, as well, though, is the longer term skills identification. And Cathal mentioned this already. I think horizon scanning is key, and that really is a role that policymakers do need to step up and do. Companies, to a certain extent, will be able to identify their immediate skills needs. They definitely will. They're now in near-term skills needs. But when it comes to the longer-term trends, when it comes to really maybe stuff of the future, but that will become reality in the next 5 to 10 years, the need at a kind of a centralized level to scan the horizon, to identify what the skills needs are, to engage with the education and training system on that, and therefore have in place or put in place the requirements that companies will have in the coming years. That's a critical feature as well. And finally, I think for Ireland in particular, there is a review ongoing at the moment of our apprenticeship system. This operates obviously hugely successfully in other member states. We've had mixed success at this in Ireland over the years. The review that's going on at the moment is hugely welcomed, I think, by stakeholders, including ourselves, but also by companies who have over the last number of years become more involved in what are industry-led models of apprenticeship. And I think the apprenticeship system in general really does lend itself very well, if done properly, to the type of retraining, reskilling, new flexible training that Cathal identified in his analysis, whereby it's not necessarily the higher education based classroom learning system. It is this combination of marrying the changing skills needs with the workforce and really helping to deliver a skilled workforce that can adapt to the changing requirements. Moving on then to, I suppose, the real bread and butter of our stuff, building resilient, or I hope building resilient enterprises. Something that has that's always really important in looking at what to do is probably taking a breath and saying, right, let's help companies focus on what they can actually control. And let's help companies focus on making investments in areas that we know matter and that we know deliver returns. So I think we continue to, it was the core or the pillars of our last strategy. It will always be the areas that we think will help to build resilience in companies, supporting companies to invest in innovation, to strengthen their competitiveness and capability, and for those who can, to diversify their global footprint. And coming back to investing in innovation, I may have mentioned this already, but if I haven't, I want to emphasize it. I think investment in R&D, investment in innovation can be a scary concept for companies. And it's really important that what we do is help companies to see that this is accessible, put in place supports, and they do exist at the moment, from something as small as a €5,000 innovation to an institute of technology or a higher education institution and say, I have this business problem, or I have this business idea, or I have this product adaptation idea, and get some high-level research done to assist them in moving on their idea and bringing it to fruition. Everything from that to companies being involved in technology centres, which are industry-led research centres in different sectors, be that dairy technology or advanced manufacturing, that we have actually an awful lot of infrastructure in place to bring companies into the innovation space. They don't necessarily have to have the in-house capability. That's not realistic when we talk about the profile of companies that exist. But in getting them to engage in collaborative innovation, I think that's really continues to be a challenge and is one that is worth pursuing. In terms of strengthening their competitiveness and capability, I think, again, it's about making this real for companies, supporting investment, and again, reducing the risk by reducing the cost of investing in areas such as digitalization. Leadership training is a huge skill that comes up over and over again. And no matter what challenge a company faces, stronger leadership will help them to address those challenges. And finally, on diversifying their global footprint, a key policy challenge for Ireland that has been identified in a recent OECD study is the narrowness of our export base. And so we really do need to look at what measures we can do to support more companies to get on that internationalization journey. To the next slide, please. Carl spoke about targeted funding and he mentioned the Just Transition Fund, and I think he's absolutely right about how important, actually, not even important, how there might be solutions that actually just make sense, that it doesn't have to be complex, that possibly naming the issue, saying what it is you want to achieve in this situation, supporting community development, supporting training and workforce development, and supporting enterprise development, that you just actually say, we're going to put targeted funding in place and try and strengthen these three areas of competency. But just in terms of, I suppose, a few other examples of maybe, and they all actually really do speak to the same theme in terms of how do you deliver high impact targeted funding? Well, going back to the Brexit response, I think the first thing is learn from other challenges. So what did we learn from, or what have we learned and continue to learn from our Brexit response? The first thing was find out who you're talking about, identify the vulnerable companies in the sectors to as much of an extent as you can. We've done that with COVID as well. Identify who's exposed for different reasons. What are the indicators that would make them exposed? So for the UK, or for the Brexit challenge, it was dependence on the UK market, size of company. It was also profitability. Those are all indicators in terms of what truly might have made you vulnerable. So you think about things like that, and then you say, well, what kind of supports can we develop? And it's never one support, it is a range of them. So you can go from the broadly accessible. So again, Cathal spoke about companies self-selecting. I think helping companies to identify where they are to establish their baseline is very important. So the development of tools such as the Brexit scorecard, which asks companies a range of questions about their areas of exposure in the areas of customs, financial, currency management. These were initial areas of exposure, dependence on the UK market. And from that, they were given a kind of a profile of themselves. So were they exposed, and also in what areas, and then some suggestions as to where they could go and what supports they could access to address those challenges. So you go from the broadly accessible, and then on occasion you go really highly targeted, and you go to you develop something like our Enter the Eurozone program, which was taking an identified group of companies who had an export presence, but not in the Eurozone market, but had products or services that our overseas market advisors would have said, yes, that will work in this market. There's a gap here. There's scope to develop here, and taking these companies on, again, a leadership development program, a management development program to develop a Eurozone market entry strategy. Another thing that Cathal mentioned, and again, I think we've seen great examples of it in Ireland in recent times, is to build upon existing strengths, to actually get companies or get regions and sectors to identify their own strengths and put in place funding for them to actually then bid for, compete for, and get funding to develop those strengths further. Over the last number of years, Enterprise Ireland has operated the Regional Enterprise Development Fund, which has supported, I think by its name, you can probably guess, collaborative initiatives in the region, in different regions, where they've identified areas of strength that they want to build upon. And it has very much focused on collaborations between community, between enterprise, and between the education and training providers in those regions. And just in terms of, and the Just Transition Fund is a very good example of it, in addition to that, using those type of models as well to identify and to put in place funding for a particular area is critical. The Border Enterprise Development Fund is a fund that was modelled completely along the lines of the Regional Enterprise Development Fund, was implemented or launched at the very start of this year. And really what its focus was, it actually had as its sole focus getting greater engagement from enterprise in the border region to be supported, to build their competitiveness, to increase their diversification. It actually wasn't new supports. It was engaging with enterprises, putting in place funding, showing that the funding had been put in place, and then through workshops, through road shows, all of this obviously pre the 13th of March or the 16th of March, getting companies in a particular identified region. This region was identified as being vulnerable to Brexit, getting them to engage with the supports systems and funding that was in place. And I'll finish then by just saying sometimes another thing to do is just target a specific policy objective. And that is name the problem and then put funding in place to do something about it. The local enterprise offices ran last year a very successful pilot program on a productivity challenge. And again, Cathal has mentioned this, but what was that? That was identifying that our OECD review of SMEs had identified productivity as an issue. So the response, or an initial response, was to say, okay, let's get companies to look for funding in a competitive process to say, I have the following productivity challenge. I have the following challenge about even something as straightforward as I want to reduce my delivery time. What can I do to improve that? What support, not even what supports, what training can I get, or what business advice or what business plan can I get put in place? So I think when we look at challenges, be they digitization, the low carbon transition, on occasion it may just be as straightforward as naming the challenge, naming the issue, and putting in place a very straightforward support for companies that is easy to access, that they understand what it's for, and almost let them get on with it then. To conclude, right, I suppose, that's kind of a whistle-stop tour through what can be done to support enterprises. Really, for policymakers, one of the huge challenges is that you always will have short-term issues. And for companies at the moment, there are some where the challenge right now is just survival. And a lot of the things that we're talking about today, long-term, even medium-term issues, just don't even come onto the agenda. But for policymakers, we've got to try and manage the short term while trying to influence the long term. And the transition to a low carbon economy is going to present challenges for enterprise, and certain sectors are vulnerable. We know that, as Cathal said, we don't know exactly who the workers are. We don't know exactly who it is. If we knew that, we'd be doing some form of maths. But these are human beings, and these are enterprises and things driven by consumer behaviour, or as they're operating at the moment, driven by health-related decisions that are changing the entire profile of the customer base. But I think what I'm trying to emphasize is that no matter what the challenge is, building enterprise resilience does remain the priority. For all of us, we need to continue to support, and I put the line here, it's and engage enterprise. You can put all of the supports in place. If we don't figure out, if we don't right size them, and if we don't figure out how to get them to make sense for enterprises, it makes the challenge much more difficult. But what we really, it still is around the themes of supporting enterprises at their different stages of growth and development to build their capability, to invest in innovation, and to increase their levels of diversification, be that product or market. That's their best chance of addressing their vulnerabilities, of remaining competitive, and of being able to stay going and surviving in an ever-changing and unpredictable market. Look, thank you again, everyone, for listening and for the opportunity to speak there. I hope it's given some thoughts or insights into kind of what can we do, or what are the options when we look at a challenge as big as the just transition, and our enterprises engaging in moving to the low carbon economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rowena. That was really excellent. I mean, you really set the context for the challenge, but also highlighting the sort of range of policies that can be implemented to assist and, as you say, engage with companies. Now, just to our third speaker, John Tomley, who will respond. John is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at University College London, and he's going to be looking at the implications of an unjust transition. Over to you, John. Oh, I think you're on mute there, John.
Schoolboy error. So I just say thank you for the invitation, and it's good to be in Dublin, and even if virtually, and it's good to learn about recent Irish developments, and there's some valuable thinking to ponder there. I want to suggest, though, that we learn from failures as well as successes, and I want to focus on, provocatively perhaps, on what I'm going to suggest was an unjust transition. And that's the transition that took place from a manufacturing to a service-based economy in the UK, especially after the 1980s. It was a very carbon-intensive economy, but that transition occurred before the debates that we're having today about the shift to a low-carbon economy. It produced in Britain what is often referred to as a north-south divide. That's to say, new patterns of regional inequality. So I want to pick up on Cattle's observation that place matters in these debates, and indeed I'm going to say that it's central to the UK story. I'm going to describe some spatial injustices which were inscribed into the transition which I've just mentioned, and I'm going to suggest as well that they were a major factor behind the Brexit vote. And what that suggests to me is the stakes that are involved in managing these transitions successfully. And currently in the UK, the politics of COVID-19 are taking a decidedly regional dimension, and what we're seeing is a replication of previous spatial injustices. So, looking at the figure on the slide, what we see is the scale of inequalities in the UK. Of course, these sorts of figures are always subject to scrutiny and potential criticism, but I think leaving aside the debates we could have about these kinds of measures, it seems fairly evident from these sorts of figures that the United Kingdom has regional inequalities than other European countries, including other large European countries such as Germany, which has gone through which in the 1970s had a similar industrial structure to the UK. So moving on to the next slide, Johnny. Can you move on to the next slide, Johnny? Yeah, there we go. What we see is that, well, there's a lot of noise in this particular figure. We see that there are shifting patterns of regional inequality among European states. But what we see in the UK is that from the 1990s onwards, a sharp acceleration in regional inequality at a time when in some other countries regional inequalities were narrowing, or in most cases were stable. So there's something happened in the UK during this period. This was a period when the transition from manufacturing to a service-based economy was accelerating, and it was accompanied by a widening of regional inequalities. What we were essentially seeing was the collapse of traditional manufacturing regions and the expansion of service industries in other parts of the country. Can we move on to the next slide, Johnny? And what I want to stress in this discussion is that what was happening here was there was not just an impact on firms and households. This was not just a process that affected firms and households. It affected communities. It was expressed in questions of belonging, a sense of loss on the part of certain communities, as old ways of life were gone in an instant. And this is a largely overlooked aspect of this important transition. And what this suggests to me, and again, this picks up on a point that Cathal made, is that we're not just, the issue here is not just one of the cash nexus. How do we invest, compensate, transfer resources? There are other issues at stake here about the extent to which people feel their communities are being damaged by these processes, especially if they're not managed correctly. Next slide, Johnny, please. And speaking of not managing these processes correctly, most of this period was presided over by the Thatcher governments in the UK, which really largely accepted processes of deindustrialization and the dereliction, the physical dereliction that accompanied that, and indeed to some extent the social disintegration that went alongside all of this. So Margaret Thatcher's approach to this was that really these communities needed to shape up and respond to the market signals. To the extent that there were interventions, these were done centrally. They were not part of to manage these processes. They were not part of a co-production of solutions of the type that Cathal was talking about earlier on. So this to some extent left these communities ill-equipped, not just to deal with this transition, but to deal with a series of other challenges which have come along in the aftermath, notably COVID-19. Next slide. Johnny, please. So what we have simultaneously occurring in the UK is the decline of certain kinds of regions organised around these old industries, carbon-intensive industries, coal mining, steel making, heavy manufacturing, and so on. But on the other side, we see a growth of a new economy, largely based around services like finance, largely occurring in London and the south of England. It would be wrong to imagine that the growth of this new economy was purely the result of market forces. Indeed, it wasn't. So in the case of Canary Wharf, as we see here in London, this was supported by massive interventions on the part of the state through the London Docklands Development Corporation, incentives through enterprise zones, the provision of public transport systems like the London Docklands Light Railway and extensions of the London Underground system and so on. So the state was supporting this process at the same time as it was presiding over decline in the north. And this is where the kind of spatial injustices could be seen to lie. So moving on to the next slide, please, Johnny. What we have here is not just a set of social, a set of economic disparities, but disparities across a range of social and other indicators. What we see in the UK are marked differences now in health conditions, which again have been revealed and reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is hitting disadvantaged northern communities much harder than it is hitting other places. So moving on to the next slide, Johnny. And this is something to think about as we head forward, as it were, because no, go back. You've gone too far there. So what we have then is a set of what in Britain are now known as left behind places. These are found across the country, but are concentrated primarily in the large towns and cities outside of London and the southeast, and in particular former industrial regions such as the northeast of England, South Wales, the old coal mining centres, and in coastal and isolated rural areas. These major concentrations of deprivation, people who've been left out as the economy has moved on. It's a problematic term in lots of ways, but it does capture the extent to which there's been an injustice in the transition process, which is now very, very difficult to address. It's a huge political issue in the UK, but it's a very difficult one to address. Next slide, please, Johnny. And this is something to think about as we. Next slide, please, Johnny. This is something to think about as we consider the shift to a low carbon economy, because there are many regions in Europe which are still heavily dependent on these old carbon intensive industries. And what we will see if we mismanage the process of this transition across Europe is the replication of these kinds of problems that we see so obviously in the UK. There are obviously examples of left behind communities in Europe, but there's the possibility of creating even more as we go forward. And this is not, as I said earlier, just a question of providing resources in the form of finance to these communities, but it's thinking about how they themselves are involved in planning their transition in a way which maintains the integrity of communities. So moving on to the last slide, Johnny. And the thing to bear in mind about all of this, I think, is that left behind places are primarily in Europe, primarily are the sites for the populist backlash against our traditional liberal democratic ways of doing things. And that's the great risk in mismanaging a transition, that we fuel political extremes, and we struggle to bring society with us as we move in the direction of what are desirable ends in the form of a low carbon economy, an innovative economy, and so on. So I bring from the UK a cautionary tale, and I think these are rather large issues, perhaps measured against the practicalities of delivering policies in particular places, but they are really crucial, I think. If we don't, and if we get them wrong, the political costs will be very high. And I'll end there.
Thank you, John. That was excellent as always, and a real stark reminder of why it's so important that a just transition is pursued, and pursued in a way that is inclusive with the communities that are most impacted. And I'll thank you for putting up a picture of Maggie Thatcher there and scaring us all. I'm old enough to remember when she did steal our milk, so it's been a reminder then. So now we have some time for question and answer sessions, and so people can use the chat function to post some questions, and I will pose them to our esteemed panel. Is there any questions coming up there now? No.
Okay.
Yep, the first one just come in there. I'll just pose to the panel. I think, how do you what is the best way to do you think to engage communities, particularly ones that feel that they have been left behind for so long? Is there any sort of, not silver bullets, but sort of practical examples of how you've engaged communities and how they've actually turned around those situations? So just open that one.
Yeah. Shall I say something, Damien?
Yep.
I think it's a very important question. In a country like the UK, the great difficulty now in engaging communities is that these are communities which have had a lot done to them over the past 40 years, let's say, and are very suspicious of anybody coming in with solutions or ideas or new ways of doing things. We're doing some work at UCL on this at the moment in County Durham. I'm trying to develop a long-term relationship with one village, a classically left behind place where the coal mine closed in 1985, and where the villagers struggled to find new economic purpose. Two things emerged from this study. One is the extraordinary social resilience of the place, and how traditional ways of coming together have served this community very well in the current pandemic. But on the other hand, this sense that there's alongside this a sense that the ties that bind are becoming increasingly stretched. What this community is telling us at the moment, in its early days in this research, but what they're telling us is that they need greater capacity to help themselves. One of the things which comes out of the discussions that we've had and out of other research actually as well, is that what's believed to be missing in these communities are forums and infrastructures to bring people together to find common solutions for their problems. These are not the sorts of places which will be saved by a new high-speed rail line or a new research institute or a free port or any of the kinds of things which are being talked about in policy terms in the UK at the moment. They will be helped most by small-scale interventions, which the community has a major role in determining the nature of those interventions. So that's my sort of initial response to that. It's not easy, it's difficult, it's long-term, it's intense, it's resource-intensive, but often lots of small, modest changes can have a big impact in local communities.
Okay, thank you, John. Carl, do you want to say anything on that, or you're on mute too now? So,
sorry about that. Yeah, no, John's covered a lot of specifics there. I suppose the issue is the extent to which. Can you see me there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The analysis that we undertook in the council is peculiar. The extent to which the analysis we undertook in the council and I presented earlier is peculiar to Ireland. I mean, we tried to put in place a framework for governments to respond, in this case, the Irish government, to respond to the transitions in Ireland. And we identified sort of the critical pieces, the vision, of course, overarching the process. And I think if you look at the vision that the council set out, I think had that been adopted, say, in the UK in the 1980s, and it would be hard to see the policies that flowed, that actually turned out to be the case in the UK. They wouldn't have aligned with that vision. In the case of the UK, this idea of participation and a shared destination, you could see how policy would have been not aligned with that, in sort of either benign neglect or managed decline would not have aligned to that vision. But then you do need to have a commitment to a good quality jobs economy. And Paul in the chat and Macdara earlier asked about what does this mean in reality. And it is difficult. I think our understanding of what good jobs means has changed since the pandemic. I think before the pandemic, we understood good jobs in terms of adequate hours and income, pensions, representation, etc. But COVID has added things like the ability to work from home, the essential nature of your work, the contact intensity and risk of your work. So it's altering what we understand good jobs to mean, and that means the policymakers have to respond collectively at a national level, and then for the enterprise agencies and the work that Rowena is doing to understand what does that mean for the supports they put in place. So are they peculiar to Ireland, or are they represented across the continent? I'd say that, in broadly speaking, the scale of the numbers, and John's map is interesting there, it may vary from economy to economy, but the pieces that you need to put in place to constructively adjust to transitions, I think, are similar, and having ownership of it. Elizabeth Nagel asked in the chat there about who the named body should be, and whether local authorities, for example, should be the ones who should take these actions forward. I don't know about all European countries, but I know that the local authorities in Ireland's case are seen to be power-wise sort of a weaker institution. You need to have a central authority, cross-representative body of departments and agencies with power to carry our recommendations forward. When our research was undertaken, there was an interdepartmental group on Future Jobs Ireland. I don't think it exists now post the election and dealing with the pandemic. It's understandable, but that type of structure that's at the centre but is representative of important powers across government should be there. And Louise asked in the chat then about what they can do to put funding out there to communities, and is competitive funding the right model? I mean, there has been a move to make access to state supports more competitive, to ensure value for money, to try remove dead weight, to meet with state aid rules. But the downside then is that you have communities that are vulnerable and NGOs that don't have the wherewithal to compete for that funding. So in our report, we looked at that, And what you actually need to do is make non-competitive seed funding, small amounts, to help communities to apply for these funding. I mean, we did hear a lot in our consultation that there's 500 million available in an urban fund, or 1 billion available in a disruptive technology fund. How does a small community of less than 500 people get together to apply for these types of access to these types of funding streams, and who should they be competing against? So design and helping people get a foot on that ladder to get these supports. And one thing about those competitive processes, even if the community is not successful, and I think, Rowena, you might be able to say something about this with the productivity voucher, even if you couldn't successfully get access to the funding under the voucher, the process of coming together to try and figure out what it is you were trying to achieve, you can then maybe get access to soft supports and other supports that aren't necessarily the funding, but that there's a value in having that competitive process to encourage communities or firms to think about what it is to be resilient. What practical measures can they put in place to fend off the worst aspects of transitions and grow? So Paul, MacDara, Elizabeth and Louise have all brought sort of those points together, in that Ireland may not be peculiar in that and that those sort of structures need to be put in place regardless of the society or economy you're dealing with, probably at a different scale.
Yeah, I'll come in, Damien, on maybe two points if I can remember what I've been planning on saying. No, the first question was about, let's say, how do you engage communities, and I absolutely the depth of research John was discussing there is, and it just does go to show sometimes the scale of the challenge and the long-term nature of it. But I suppose maybe going at something, at a more kind of day-to-day approach, I think the evidence that I would see in front of me is the importance of the local stakeholder engagement, and actually the local the relationships that exist between, we'll call it, official structures. So let's say your IDA office, your Midlands Enterprise Ireland office, your local enterprise office in the region, and so on, and businesses in that community, that those are critical. So you have, as Cathal said, Ireland is very small, and an awful lot of our policy direction is and should be centrally led. But it's when those decisions are taken about, what are the policy objectives, what are the measures to put in place. It's actually the strength of the relationships and the engagements at the areas in the areas you're trying to target, I think is critical to the success of it. And if I were to go back to, I mentioned earlier, let's say the Border Enterprise Development Fund, and this will be a new challenge, hopefully not long term, it will be a new challenge for this kind of targeted funding at the moment, because you can't physically go into the regions, but you can engage with them. You find new ways to engage with them. But if you go back to the Border Enterprise Development Fund, that was announced, and then there was a period of engagement for a few weeks before the funding was then launched and people were to apply for the funding, whereby there were actual, if you almost want to call them, town hall meetings in locations around that region, where it was explained to companies, they were invited to come in, and they really did engage what the different funding supports were, how to apply for them, etc. So to me, there's a critically important role for the stakeholders in the regions, or in that one is trying to target, and for not just the community relationships, but that engagement between the official structures and then the businesses in the areas. And sorry, if I could add as well, the higher education institutions in those areas as well. And I think you can actually see, and sorry, just it's a kind of a segue on that, but it does show how this works. The engagement that has happened in different regions in light of COVID-19 between our regional, the Department of Social Protection in the regions, and again, the various other bodies in the regions in terms of labour market activation, engaging companies, and even in the Midlands, there has been an awful lot of that in labour market activation, where enterprises in the regions who are looking for employees who have certain skills have been almost match made, formally or informally, with employees who are coming out of industry that is no longer there, or jobs that are not going to be there in the short term. So that's one, I suppose, observation I would make: the strength of relationships in regions that you were trying to target, both, as I said, formal and informal relationships, and the strength of the formal structures in those regions are critically important. Louise, I think it was asked a question about the competitive versus the non-competitive. I think you're absolutely right. There is no way that competitive funding is the only way for supports to be offered, because it is about also providing access to capacity building on a non-competitive basis. If you were to look at the local enterprise office business mentor structure, that would be an example of that. Or similarly, I mentioned earlier the innovation vouchers the innovation vouchers product, which is a non-competitive voucher funding available for a company of any size to be able to engage with a research institution